Sometimes the world forgets that true worth doesn't wear designer labels or speak in loud voices. It walks quietly with grace in worn jeans and a kind smile. This is the story of a woman who was judged too quickly until the truth surfaced, and dignity stood taller than wealth, proving that appearances deceive, but character endures. Grace Caldwell stepped onto that plane wearing nothing but comfort and kindness. An old gray hoodie, well-loved jeans, and the soft elegance of someone who had nothing to prove. To the flight attendants and polished passengers, she was invisible, at best a mistake. At worst, a trespasser in a world stitched together by silk scarves and shiny shoes. No one asked who she was. They simply looked her up and down and decided in the space of a blink that she didn't belong. It's a painful truth that many older adults know too well. How easily the world makes assumptions based on what you wear, how you walk, or whether you still fit society's narrow mold of success. Grace wasn't loud, she wasn't flashy, but beneath her quiet was a lifetime of strength and a husband who knew exactly who she was. This story isn't just about luxury cabins or mistaken identity. It's about the heartbreak of being unseen in plain sight. It's about every woman who's been told, subtly or not, that her value faded with her fashion, her age, or her silence. Grace was judged by appearance. But what followed proved that character, not clothing, is what truly defines class. Grace didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice or demand recognition. Instead, she sat quietly, her back straight, her eyes calm, as strangers laughed and whispered, as attendants questioned her presence like she was a stain on fine leather. Each word hurled at her. Wrong place, charity case. Go back where you belong. Cut deep, but she wore her dignity like armor. And in that moment, her silence spoke louder than any outburst could have. For many older women, this moment is all too familiar. Not in a cabin lined with champagne flutes, but in doctors' offices, grocery stores, or even within their own families. The world begins to look past you, dismiss you, or treat you as if you're simply in the way. And yet, like Grace, you hold your head high. You've lived too long, endured too much to let ignorance define you. What Grace endured was more than poor service. It was a public stripping of identity, a modern-day shaming masked as policy. But even as her heart ached and humiliation wrapped around her like cold air, she stood tall in spirit. Because when you've weathered real storms, a few sneers on a plane are little more than passing turbulence. They didn't just question her ticket, they questioned her worth. As Grace was marched down that narrow aisle, past rows of polished wood and pressed suits, the air grew thick with something crueler than judgment: humiliation. Passengers chuckled, some openly, others behind raised newspapers. One man even lifted his phone to snap a photo, as if her discomfort was entertainment. A woman in a fur coat leaned over and whispered with faux concern, "Sweetheart, you're embarrassing yourself," as if kindness could soften condescension. But Grace didn't break. She didn't plead or lash out. She carried herself like a woman who'd learned long ago that silence, when rooted in self-respect, is more powerful than any spotlight. Still, the sting of public shaming doesn't vanish with Grace. It lingers like a bruise on the soul. Many seniors know that ache too well, being overlooked, laughed at, or treated like they no longer matter. That moment on the plane wasn't just a personal insult. It was a performance of cruelty, one in which Grace had no script. But she showed every onlooker the kind of strength that isn't draped in luxury or defended with anger. Her response was quiet, but it echoed with the weight of a life lived in truth, not appearance. Grace didn't need to raise her voice to make a statement. She didn't throw insults, demand special treatment, or reveal the powerful name she carried. Instead, she chose the quiet strength that only comes with age, with life experience, with the wisdom to know that not every battle must be loud to be won. While others mocked, while attendants scoffed and strangers sneered, she sat still, anchored in a truth no one else in that cabin could see. There's something profoundly noble about a person who can endure public humiliation without surrendering their self-respect. And it's a kind of strength that older adults know well. When you've lived long enough, you realize that appearances are fleeting, but character, that endures. Grace's dignity wasn't in her clothes or her seat. It was in the way she refused to be shaken by people who couldn't see her worth. For seniors who have often been overlooked or underestimated, Grace's silence is familiar. It is the silence of someone who's been through much worse and chosen, time and again, to carry herself with grace, pun intended. Her quiet was not weakness. It was a declaration. I know who I am even if you don't. And in a world that so often shouts to be heard, Grace reminded us all that sometimes the strongest voice is the one that refuses to scream. Just when the world seemed to have turned its back on Grace, a quiet storm stepped onto the plane. Her husband, Nathan Caldwell. He didn't arrive with fanfare. He didn't need to. The moment he appeared tall and composed, the cabin shifted. You could feel it in the hush, in the way heads turned, in the sudden silence that followed his steady footsteps. He wasn't just a man in a suit, he was a man with purpose. And that purpose was protecting the woman he loved. There's something deeply moving about a love that doesn't just speak, it acts. Nathan didn't defend Grace because she was wealthy. He defended her because she mattered. Because in a world that tried to diminish her, he reminded everyone watching that respect is not earned through appearances, but through humanity. For older couples, for anyone who stood the test of time, his actions spoke to something eternal. That love, when rooted in honor, doesn't flinch in the face of injustice. In that moment, Nathan didn't just reclaim her seat, he reclaimed her dignity. And for every older woman who's ever felt invisible, and every older man who's ever wanted to stand up for what's right, his quiet fury was more than satisfying. It was justice, love, and strength woven into one unforgettable moment. It didn't happen in a courtroom or on a grand stage. It happened midair above the clouds, where truth often floats unnoticed. But that day, justice descended at 30,000 feet. With a voice that never needed to rise, Nathan Caldwell stripped away every layer of arrogance that had cloaked the crew and passengers who had judged his wife. One by one, their excuses unraveled. The smirks faded, and the shame they had so freely poured onto Grace came crashing back in waves. Older adults know what it means to wait for justice, to carry quiet wounds and wonder if dignity will ever be defended. But in this moment, Grace's vindication wasn't whispered, it was declared. Not for vengeance, but for principle. Nathan didn't shout, he didn't grandstand, he simply stood tall in the truth, and that truth was unshakable. Grace was worthy, always had been, and always would be. For those who've ever felt overlooked, who've endured small indignities in silence, this moment felt like a reckoning. A reminder that fairness, when it finally arrives, has the power to heal more than one person. It uplifts everyone who's ever swallowed their pride to keep the peace. That day, the plane didn't just reach its destination. It restored something sacred, Grace's rightful place and her voice. In that gilded cabin of first class, where champagne flowed and designer bags gleamed beneath soft lighting, the assumption was simple. If you looked the part, you belonged. Grace didn't, not in their eyes. Her hoodie, her quiet presence, her lack of flashy accessories, these were seen as signals of lesser worth. But what they failed to understand is something many older Americans know in their bones. True respect isn't reserved for the wealthy. It's a birthright we all deserve. Grace didn't ask for special treatment. She didn't lean on power or wealth. All she wanted was to be treated fairly, to sit in the seat she paid for without mockery or malice. Her presence challenged their perception of privilege, and in doing so exposed a painful truth. In today's world, people still confuse appearance with value. For seniors who've been underestimated simply because of a slower pace, gray hair, or modest attire, Grace's story rings especially true. It's a reminder that we live in a society too quick to judge and too slow to honor what really matters. Respect should not be earned by the shine of your shoes or the label on your luggage. It should be granted for your humanity, your history, and the quiet resilience that so many carry without applause. Grace Caldwell could have ended it all with a single word, her last name. Just one mention of Caldwell, and the tone of the cabin would have flipped in an instant. The attendants would have bowed with apologies, the passengers would have silenced their laughter, and she would have been ushered to her seat with forced reverence. But Grace didn't reach for power. She reached for something far more rare, her integrity. She chose not to wield her name as a weapon, Because to her, worth should never depend on who you're married to or how many zeros sit in your bank account. That decision to stay silent and endure wasn't weakness. It was principle. It was a quiet stand for every person who doesn't have a powerful name to shield them, every older woman who's been overlooked, every gentle soul who's been treated like they don't belong. For seniors who've walked through life proving themselves time and time again, Grace's restraint feels familiar. Sometimes we carry ourselves with quiet strength because we know the truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs to stand tall. Grace reminded us that real courage isn't just about speaking out. It's about knowing when not to speak and still holding your ground with grace, pride, and unshakable self-worth. What happened on that flight wasn't just about one woman in a hoodie. It was about a culture, a mindset, a system that rewards polish and punishes humility. Grace's experience pulled back the curtain on a deeper problem. The silent ways bias shows up, not in shouted slurs, but in skeptical glances, unnecessary questions, and assumptions cloaked in policy. But when the truth came out, when Nathan stood beside his wife and demanded answers, something remarkable happened. The room shifted. Accountability was no longer optional. For many older Americans, this moment felt deeply familiar. We've seen the world look past people who don't fit the mold, who move a little slower, speak a little softer, or choose comfort over couture. And too often we've watched injustices brushed aside with empty apologies and no change. But this time was different. Grace didn't just want an apology. She asked for something more powerful: change, retraining, reform, a written acknowledgement. She didn't want revenge. She wanted reflection. And that, more than any punishment, is how transformation begins. For anyone who has ever been dismissed, diminished, or disregarded, her courage was a quiet revolution. And for those in power, it was a call to rise, not just in title, but in conscience. Because real leadership listens, learns, and does better. In a world obsessed with status, too many forget that real class has nothing to do with cashmere scarves or black cards. It's measured by how we treat people when we think no one important is watching. The flight crew looked at Grace and saw someone less than, simply because she didn't match their narrow idea of who belonged in first class. But that's the test, isn't it? Not how you serve the loudest guest or the one dripping in diamonds, but how you serve the quiet woman in old jeans, the man who doesn't boast, the elder who moves with gentle purpose. For so many older adults, this message hits home. You've felt the sting of being overlooked, passed by, or spoken to as if you were invisible. And yet, like Grace, you carry yourself with quiet dignity, not because the world sees it, but because it's who you are. Grace reminded us all that the true definition of premium isn't stitched into a seat or written on a boarding pass. It's in the small acts of grace, the unseen kindness, the respect offered freely and equally. That is the kind of class money can't buy, and it's the kind that leaves a lasting legacy long after the plane has landed. Grace never asked for anyone to be punished. That's not who she was. It's not who. When the dust settled and the apologies poured in, she didn't demand vengeance. She asked for reform, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been quietly turned away, dismissed, or doubted. She could have walked away, content with personal vindication, but instead she used her voice to spark something greater, a change in culture, not just in policy. That's the mark of true wisdom, something many seniors understand well. The difference between reacting in anger and responding with purpose. Grace understood that firing one person wouldn't fix the problem, but educating a team, retraining a staff, and opening eyes to unconscious bias, that's how systems evolve. That's how dignity becomes standard, not exception. For older Americans who have spent a lifetime watching the world shift, often in painful or impersonal ways, this moment was powerful because it showed that you're never too small to make a difference, and it's never too late to expect better. Grace reminded everyone that real change doesn't come from shouting the loudest, but from planting the deepest roots. She turned humiliation into a movement, not of outrage, but of enlightenment. And through her courage, a flight that started with exclusion became a journey towards something far more meaningful: respect for every traveler, no matter their story, their status, or their shoes. Grace didn't walk off that plane in triumph with a roar of applause. She stepped off with her hoodie still on, her head held high, and her dignity completely intact. The people who mocked her were silenced not by revenge, but by the undeniable power of her quiet strength. And that, in the end, was the real victory. Not the firings, not the blacklists, but the shift that took place in hearts, minds, and policy, because one woman chose to respond with grace, not wrath. For so many older adults, this kind of strength is familiar. It's the strength built not in moments of glory, but in years of showing up, being overlooked, and choosing to rise with kindness anyway. Grace's victory wasn't loud, but it was felt. In every reformed policy, every retrained employee, and every passenger now treated with the dignity they always deserved. Her story is a reminder that you don't need a spotlight to create change. You just need the courage to be seen exactly as you are and to never apologize for it. Grace showed us all that the most powerful victories are the quiet ones, the ones that restore faith, the ones that ripple outward, and the ones that remind us respect isn't earned by appearance. It's affirmed by character, always. Grace's experience didn't just rattle a few employees. It sent a shockwave through an industry that had long relied on surface-level impressions. Her quiet presence and the loud injustice that followed became a mirror reflecting something deeper. A customer service culture built too often on assumptions, not compassion. The ripple effect was undeniable. Policies were re-examined, training programs rewritten, and feedback systems rebuilt from the ground up. What started as a moment of humiliation became a movement for human dignity. For many older Americans who have lived through eras of both incredible progress and persistent prejudice, this moment felt like long overdue validation. So many have stood at counters, on phone calls, or in waiting rooms and felt that subtle sting, being dismissed, talked down to, or treated like a burden. Grace's story wasn't just about her seat. It was about all of our places in a world that too often forgets the value of kindness. The airline industry may fly high, but its heart must stay grounded in empathy, in fairness, in the simple truth that every traveler deserves to be seen, heard, and honored. Thanks to one woman in a gray hoodie, the skies became just a little more just. And for anyone who has ever felt unseen, that change is nothing short of revolutionary. They looked at Grace and saw what they wanted to see. A woman in a hoodie with no designer bag or diamond watch, someone who clearly didn't belong. But they never stopped to ask, to wonder, or even to look past the surface. And that's where they failed, because appearances can deceive, and so can assumptions. Grace didn't need status symbols to prove her worth. She had something far more rare: humility, kindness, and self-respect. Traits that don't sparkle in the light, but shine where it counts. In the way you treat others, in the way you hold your head high, even when the world tries to bring you low. Older Americans know this truth well. Many have been misjudged for gray hair, slower steps, or simply for choosing comfort over appearance. But those same people carry stories, wisdom, and quiet strength that no designer label could ever match. Grace's story reminds us that what truly matters isn't how someone looks, but how they live, love, and carry themselves. The world may still judge the book by its cover, but every now and then, a story like Grace's reminds us all to turn the page before we cast our verdict. In a world where luxury is often measured by logos and price tags, Grace reminded us that true dignity wears no label. She walked into that first-class cabin without gold jewelry or tailored suits, just a quiet presence and the quiet confidence of someone who knows her worth. While others flaunted status, she carried something more enduring: self-respect. She didn't win by shouting. She didn't demand to be seen. She simply stood her ground, allowed the cruelty to unfold, and let her character speak for itself. And in the end, it wasn't her husband's power or her wealth that changed everything. It was her unshakable grace in the face of arrogance. Many older Americans understand this truth. They've lived through seasons where appearance was everything, only to discover that what matters most can't be worn or bought. It's carried in the way you treat others and how you carry yourself when no one's watching. Grace's story is more than a cautionary tale. It's a tribute to every woman, every senior, every soul who's ever been judged by the outside but honored by what lies within. In a world dazzled by glamour, Grace proved that dignity, pure, unwavering dignity, will always outshine the fanciest name stitched into a purse. Grace's story isn't just about an airline seat. It's about every moment we're underestimated, every time kindness is mistaken for weakness, and every quiet soul who's ever risen with dignity instead of rage. For older Americans, it's a reminder that true worth has nothing to do with age or appearance. It lives in how we carry ourselves when no one is looking. In the end, it wasn't wealth that lifted Grace above the crowd. It was Grace itself, timeless, quiet, and profoundly powerful.